This video started very simply. All I wanted to do was to try to find actual evidence for a release date for Cyberpunk 2077. This isn't a video where I'm just going to say, hey, I think it's coming out in late 2019 because X, Y, and Z. This is actually going to deep dive into financial reports, press briefings, everything that CD Projekt Red has done to provide actual evidence. Because one of my biggest pet peeves is when gaming YouTubers just say stuff with a clickbait title and don't provide any evidence.
The kettle is calling the pot black.
So today we're going to deep dive, and I'm warning you, it's going to get kind of complicated, but I'll try to explain it as I go. For those of you who don't know, right now I'm actually studying corporate finance and marketing in school. So I'm actively studying this. When I'm not making YouTube videos, I tend to be doing projects with big corporations that are in northern Colorado where I live, such as Otterbox and New Belgium, and doing all sorts of projects, breaking down financial statements, making investment recommendations, that sort of thing. It's kind of my bread and butter, and I find it pretty easy to do and kind of interesting, so I figured why not apply that sort of skill onto gaming, and this happens to be an applicable circumstance. So here we go. Now, all of this is going to be pretty grossly oversimplified, and that's just to make it easy to consume because I fully recognize that deep diving into financial documents isn't super easy to consume. So I'm going to try to lighten it up a little bit, make it easier to take in. So to start out very simply, basically what happens is when there's a corporation that's publicly traded, they have to have what we would call like a 10K document, which is something that the company can send to an investor if the investor requests financial information. So say I invested in CD Projekt Red, I live in Poland and I'm rocking out. I say, hey, CD Projekt, I'm an investor. I want information on your finances to make sure you're not abusing your finances, you're not spending it on yachts and parties and drugs and crap like that. So they would send me a 10K, and the 10K document or documents like it are in the US mandated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, and then in Europe it's mandated by all sorts of different agencies as well. So it's a universal thing that these companies have to provide in-depth financial documents if they are publicly traded. This is why you can't find these same documents about like Bethesda Game Studios to see how much money they were spending and when on development and all of this, because they're not publicly traded in the same way. They're owned by Softworks, which is owned by ZeniMax. It's kind of complicated. Now, as for CD Projekt Red, they are publicly traded, and so you can actually go to their website and find their 10K right here in an XLS file, which is super useful because it opens up in Excel really easily. Now, this is what it looks like. Now, I've done a little bit of modification onto it, which I'll explain in a moment, but pretty much they provide you a ton of information. They print all of this out and they give you all of this data that you can break down however you would like. It basically is just to provide full transparency to the investor. So if you have any questions about how your money is being spent, you can find it in the document. Now, CD Projekt Red actually goes all the way back in their 10K, all the way back to 2010. So you can actually deep dive into their finances from 2010 to break down how they've progressed and how their current CEO, for instance, is functioning compared to his previous staff that he had underneath him. And using all of this information, you make investment recommendations, and this is normally what like an investment or stockbroker would be doing. They'd be analyzing all of this stuff. What we're interested in are the few most recent years for CD Projekt Red, because that's when Cyberpunk 2077 was being developed fully. Now, a couple quick caveats before we deep dive into this data, because I know some of you might be interested in it. All of the information that's originally in this document, all of the numbers and everything are in the Polish currency, PLN, or Zvolta, or however it's pronounced. I'm not going to pretend like I know. I probably just butchered it. But because the majority of my audience is more familiar with the US dollar, I figured I would just provide a quick conversion over to the US dollar, because why not? And so as of the time of this recording, the current multiplier that I used was 0.26525. Do with that what you will. Basically, all I'm saying is that these numbers aren't completely exact because conversion rates are constantly changing. It is exact, for instance, in Polish currency, but once we're converting it over into US dollar and pound and all those things, it starts to get a little muddy because those conversion rates constantly shift around. So this is a rough estimate. It's within just a few percentage points of the final number for sure, but just so you know, it's not completely exact. Now, the way I see it, there are 2, maybe 3 categories in this whole document that we're actually interested in deep diving into. And those categories are completely useless unless we contrast them with other information, which we'll get to, because we can find exactly how much money they spent on development costs in 2014, for instance. But if we don't know what to contrast that with, it doesn't do us any good at all. And in a large corporation such as CD Projekt Red, they tend to bury some of their finances into these broader categories, which is completely legal and it's completely fine usually for normal investors. But when we're trying to break down and find when one game that they're working on is going to release, it's a little more difficult. So basically what we're looking at when we find this document is we're trying to break down development costs. We're going to contrast that with previous games that they've released. Then we're going to look for large amounts of cash or perhaps clearing out of liabilities in preparation for a large marketing campaign, which CD Projekt Red has already communicated they're going to have. They're going to have a huge marketing push for Cyberpunk 2077 once it actually comes out. So we're looking for a few red flags to give us the hint that they might be revving up for a release. So as we break this down, all of this information is pretty standard. I mean, it's just money. I mean, there's not a whole lot to be expected here. Income tax statements, selling costs, all of that's completely normal. Where we're interested is assets. Now, the reason that assets is interesting is because that's where a lot of the development resources are going to be put into. So for instance, if a gaming developer is paying a lot of money to develop a new system or to develop a motion capture technology that they're going to use in the game, that is going to be categorized under assets because it's an asset to the company that they can eventually use to sell something. Just like if Ford buys a bunch of steel, that steel isn't worth a whole lot to them initially, but they can convert that into a sellable product, into a car, and so it would be categorized as an asset that's going to eventually be sellable, if that makes sense. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the most recent date on this current 10K that we're looking at is at the end of Q3 of 2018, which was September 30th of 2018. And I know what you're thinking, why aren't we looking at one all the way through Q4 with the full year finances available? They haven't released it yet. And I'm not an investor, so I don't have early access to those documents like some of the investors have access to it. So we're going off of the information we have. If you want to follow up video analyzing the full 2018 financial documents, let me know, and we can do that once those are made public. But this is what we're looking at, basically through September 30th, starting all the way back in 2010. The 2 categories we're actually interested in here, that at least I'm most interested in analyzing it, are expenditures on development projects and goodwill. Now, expenditures on development projects, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's basically money that they're pouring into development projects. The thing is, though, that CD Projekt Red is a big company now. They're working on several projects. So this can include everything from Gwent to Thornbreaker. Depending on the year we're looking at, that can include the Blood and Wine DLC for The Witcher 3 or Hearts of Stone, or even upkeep development on Witcher 3. It can include a lot of things, including CD Projekt or Cyberpunk 2077, but it can include a lot of things besides that. The safe assumption is that the majority of this money, the overwhelming majority of development money, is being put into the new game that's going to be coming out first, which is Cyberpunk. But the farther back we go, we have to separate that out and assume that more money was being spent on their current projects in that time versus the game we're interested in now, being Cyberpunk. Now, the reason I'm interested in goodwill is because this actually gives a fairly good estimation of the value that a company is prescribing onto an acquisition. So basically what happens is if a company like CD Projekt Red is buying out a company, they're going to offer them a set amount of money that's probably a little more than their company is directly valued at. They purchase that company, and then that difference can be ascribed to goodwill. It's basically what they're valuing a company being. And or the net profit or benefit of a company being, besides just their raw costs. So for instance, we know that in March of 2018, CD Projekt Red acquired a studio that eventually became Overclocked, whatever it is, which is a very technologically advanced area. It's basically like the Silicon Valley of Poland. So it's a very important acquisition for them. The interesting thing as an analyst looking at this would be that this was only in March, and usually game developers buy out a studio a year or two before release, which actually lines up with potentially a late 2019, early 2020 release. But we'll circle back to that. Another important acquisition that we also know about from about 5 months ago, Game Rant's article here discusses it, was the mobile game studio Spoko, which they acquired. Again, the exact amounts on this is pretty closed off. You find out when you're an investor, they detail this a little more in detail. It's not super important for us, but what this basically means is that they've said that this studio is going to be working on a lot of their projects, and specifically, quote, Spoko approached us with an interesting idea based on one of our brands, an idea that we decided to invest in. We want to expand our business with innovative concepts and solutions, and the vision presented to us by the Spoko team represents an entirely novel and creative angle. Basically, they pitched a game idea based off of one of their franchises, and they said, yeah, no, let's run with it. That could be The Witcher, that could be Cyberpunk. We don't really know. My guess personally would be that they're going to be doing sort of a mobile launch alongside Cyberpunk, maybe, and perhaps based on one of the mini games that we'll have within Cyberpunk, similar to Gwent with The Witcher 3, but we'll just have to wait and see. So basically what these two categories can tell us financially is how much money they're spending on developing a game, and then also how much money that they are pouring into expansions to also continue developing those games that they already have established or that they're currently working on. Now, for the sake of easy consumption, I put all of this into a few charts. Goodwill and expenditures on development projects are the most important ones. Red and blue pair together because they're from the same year. But more importantly, if we loop down to 2017, you can actually look at the money that they were spending on development and that they estimated in goodwill between December 31st of 2016 and December 31st of 2017. And you can see that they significantly revved up their spending on development in that time period. And bear in mind that in 2016, we got Blood and Wine. So some of that money they were spending in 2016 was for Blood and Wine, which means that the money they were spending on Cyberpunk was even smaller. So imagine cutting that bar perhaps even in half. That's pretty significant. That means they significantly revved up and started spending a crap ton of money starting in 2017. And in fact, if you look at the overall expenditures on development projects from 2016, 17, and 18, like as of September 30th, you can actually see that there's an estimated 114 million US dollars being spent on development projects. It's fair to say that in 2016, some of this was spent on Blood and Wine, but probably not a whole lot of it, especially if they were starting to rev up and move most of the team over to Cyberpunk and left some core personnel over here working on Blood and Wine. It makes sense that some of it was spent there, but probably the overwhelming majority was on Cyberpunk, which means this game already could be looking at a budget around 80 to 100 million, which actually jives with what we know that CD Projekt Red spent on The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, which cost $81 million to make in the US currency. And that even includes some of the marketing that they did. So some of those cinematic trailers and all of those things that normally aren't counted directly into the development cost of the game. They're usually separated out, and on a 10K, they would be separated out as advertising and marketing fees and then development fees, which is pretty significant. Basically, it just means that they're getting ready to spend a hell of a lot more money on Cyberpunk than they did on The Witcher 3, which is pretty cool. Now, years and years ago, we got reports that Cyberpunk 2077 was going to be, quote, far, far bigger than The Witcher 3 was. We didn't really know what that translated to. It kind of made sense that iterative releases would look like that. But here we can actually see financially they're getting ready to spend 25-30% more on the development budget alone for this game, which means they're putting a lot of eggs in this basket. And here's the thing, I tried to go back even further, such as 2015 and 2014, specifically 2014 because I wanted to deep dive into how much money they were spending around this time for The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Tough thing is, they didn't categorize development expenditures as its own line item. They categorized it in with other things such as inventories and intangible development costs, basically. So they muffled it into a bunch of other categories, which means it's very, very difficult to separate it out if if not just outright impossible, because it's buried in the fine print that you can't get to unless you work for the company or can speak with the CEO and he can break it down. You really just don't know. But basically, all of this is just to say that CD Projekt Red is clearly revving up the finalized stages of development. As of September 30th of 2018, they were spending $60 million in development of new projects, and it's safe to assume those new projects are primarily Cyberpunk 2077 and perhaps some other side projects they're working on in the early stages, which is basically just paying writers' fees and that sort of thing, and concept artists. It's not really deep diving into development costs, which is where the brunt of those expenditures come from. So it's safe to assume that the overwhelming majority of that $60 million went straight to Cyberpunk 2077, which is kind of insane. Now, of course, we don't know exact details about this. We don't know exactly how all of this breaks down, and you can't know it unless you deep dive into their finances within the company, and you can break down each line item, which we simply can't do unless you work for them. And then there's a bunch of NDAs and things that make it so you can't do that. But what we can assume by digging into the publicly available data is that CD Projekt Red is wrapping up development. They're getting ready to spend, and already have likely spent, way more money than they did for The Witcher 3 on Cyberpunk 2077, and they haven't even gotten to the marketing campaign yet, which likely means that they're revving up for a large marketing campaign near the end of 2019 to either release in the holiday season of 2019 or in early 2020. I personally, looking at all the data, they've cleared out some of their liabilities, they've cleared out some debts, and they currently hold no debts whatsoever. So it looks like they're getting ready to spend a lot of money on a marketing push, and normally companies don't clear out that money unless they're getting ready to do something soon, which likely means we're looking this fiscal year in 2019, which is pretty exciting. And of course, there's a lot of moving parts to this. It could change tomorrow. They could find some major glitch in their engine that requires 3 months of rewriting, and it's going to push it back to June of 2020. We don't know, and the game development is super complicated. But what we do know is that the finances allow for the game to release holiday of 2019, and unlike a lot of other sort of speculative videos, there actually seems to be some evidence for this. So, yeah. But that's all I got. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like. If you want to see more like it, make sure to subscribe. And if you have any questions or anything, leave comments down below. I will be reading through all of them. If you want to get a hold of me, Twitter, Discord, all that fun stuff, let me know. I'll be looking forward to it. Peace out. I'm tired. Bye.